It was a Tuesday like any other at the San Diego Naval Base. The California sky displayed that deep blue that always reminded me of the ocean I chose as my second home when I joined the United States. My name is Samantha Hayes, a 28-year-old U.S. Navy lieutenant and combat and rescue medic, 6 years in the force, and I still felt that butterflies in my stomach every time I put on my uniform. That morning, I received a call from Balboa Naval Hospital. My grandfather, James Hayes, a decorated Vietnam War veteran, had been admitted after collapsing at home. I requested a discharge from my commanding officer, who understood the situation and released me immediately. "Family is priority, Hayes. Go take care of your old man," he said with a brief nod. I drove my Jeep as if I were on a rescue mission in hostile territory. My palms were sweating against the steering wheel. My grandfather was more than family. He was my hero, my mentor. The reason I had chosen military life had been a combat medic in Vietnam, saving lives amidst chaos and destruction. His stories shaped my childhood and later, my career. I parked at the hospital and ran to the reception desk. My boots echoed across the linoleum floor as I approached the counter. "I'm Lieutenant Samantha Hayes. My grandfather, James Hayes, was brought here this morning." The receptionist typed on the computer and informed me he was in room 507 on the 5th floor. I thanked her and headed for the elevators. While I waited, I felt my phone vibrate. It was my mother, Diana. "Sam, I'm glad you could make it. Dad isn't doing well. The doctors are worried about his heart." I swallowed hard. "I'm going up. I'll meet you there." The elevator seemed to move in slow motion. I stared at my reflection in the metal doors. My navy blue uniform contrasted with my pale skin and red eyes, which struggled to hold back tears. I took a deep breath. Emotional control was crucial in the Navy, but it was difficult to maintain composure when it came to family. Stepping out of the elevator, I turned right and walked down the hallway until I found room 507. My mother was outside talking to a doctor. Her face was streaked with fresh tears. When she saw me, she gave me a small smile and hugged me tightly. "Dr. Patterson is explaining the situation," she said, turning to the doctor. Dr. Patterson was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a serious expression. "Lieutenant Hayes, your grandfather suffered a significant heart attack. We've stabilized his condition, but he'll require surgery. His age is a complicating factor." "Can I see him?" I asked. "Sure, but he's sedated. Surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning." I entered the room and saw my grandfather lying in bed, looking smaller and more frail than I had ever seen him. Tubes and wires connected him to machines that monitored his vital signs. I sat beside him and held his wrinkled hand. "I'm here, Grandpa," I whispered. "I'll be okay." I spent the afternoon at the hospital, taking turns with my mother to stay by his side. My father arrived later, after finishing his shift at the local police. We were a family of public servants. My grandfather in the Navy, my father in the police force, and I following in old James's footsteps. As night approached, my mother insisted that I go home and rest. "Are you on duty tomorrow?" "No, I asked for a few days off. I want to be here for the surgery." "Then go get some sleep. I'll call you if there's any change." Reluctantly, I agreed. I kissed my grandfather on the forehead and promised to return early the next day. On the way home, I stopped at a convenience store for a coffee. The clerk, a young college student, looked at my uniform with a mixture of curiosity and respect. "Tough day?" he asked, handing me my coffee. "Yes, my grandfather is in the hospital. He was also a soldier. I hope he gets better soon, ma'am." "Thanks." I returned to my apartment, a small studio near the naval base. It was Spartan, reflecting my disciplined life, a neatly made bed, a few photographs on the walls, and books neatly arranged on a bookshelf. I hung up my uniform and took a hot shower, letting the water wash away some of the pent-up tension. I lay down, but sleep didn't come easily. Memories of my grandfather flooded me. Him teaching me to swim in the lake near his country house, telling stories about Vietnam by the light of the campfire, proudly watching my graduation from the Naval Academy. My cell phone rang at 5:30 a.m. It was my mother, her voice shaky. "Sam, you need to get here now." Your grandfather got worse overnight. I got dressed in record time and drove to the hospital as if my life depended on it. The sun was still rising when I parked in the same spot as the day before. I rushed inside, ignoring the slow elevator in favor of the stairs. I took the 5 floors 2 at a time, my breath quickening more from fear than exertion. When I reached the 5th floor, I saw a frantic movement of nurses and doctors coming in and out of my grandfather's room. My mother was leaning against the opposite wall, her face contorted in anguish. My father held her close, trying to offer comfort. "What happened?" I asked, breathless. "He had another heart attack. They're trying to stabilize him so they can take him into emergency surgery." At that moment, Dr. Patterson emerged from the room. His face said it all before he even opened his mouth. "Mrs. Hayes, Lieutenant," he began, addressing my mother and me. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Hayes' condition has deteriorated significantly. We're doing everything we can, but ... But what, doctor?" I pressed, my voice firmer than I expected. "His heart is failing. We need to get him to the ICU immediately." I nodded, swallowing the lump forming in my throat. "Can we see him first?" Quickly, preparing the transport. We entered the room. My grandfather was awake, his blue eyes, so similar to mine, dull with an oxygen tube aided his labored breathing. "Sammy," he murmured when he saw me, using his only nickname, "my Navy girl." "I'm here, Grandpa," he said, holding his hand carefully. He tried to smile, but grimaced in pain. "I'm proud of you, you know." Following in the footsteps of this old sailor, "I learned from the best," I replied, fighting back tears. My mother came over and kissed his forehead. "Dad, they'll take care of you. We'll be here when you get back." He nodded slightly, his eyes focused on something beyond us. "Diana, you look so much like your mother." My grandmother had passed away 5 years ago, and the comment made my mother cry silently. Dr. Patterson and 2 nurses entered the room. "We need to take him now." We reluctantly stepped aside and watched as they prepared my grandfather for. Just as they were about to move him into the hallway, he raised a weak hand, beckoning me over. I quickly approached. "Yes, Grandpa?" "Remember what I always say, courage is not about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you're afraid." I nodded, holding back tears. "I remember. Now be brave for us, okay?" He tried to respond, but was interrupted by a shrill alarm from one of the machines. His body twitched violently, his eyes rolling back in his head. "Code Blue!" one of the nurses shouted. "He's going into cardiac arrest." Dr. Patterson began pushing the bed into the hallway. "Get him to the ER. Room 3. We need a CPR team now." We ran after them as they carried my grandfather down the halls to the emergency room. My mind was on autopilot, years of Navy EMS training taking over. When we arrived at the emergency room, a medical team was already on alert. A younger doctor began giving orders, positioning people around my grandfather's bed. The heart monitor showed a nearly flat line. "Starting CPR," a nurse announced, preparing for chest compression. At that moment, something inside me clicked. This wasn't just my grandfather. He was a war veteran, a hero, a man who saved countless lives in battle. He deserved someone who knew exactly what he was doing. I stepped forward, determinedly. My grandfather frowned disdainfully, still conscious for a fleeting moment. "Stay back," he muttered, perhaps out of pride, perhaps because he didn't want me to see him in that state. "Code Blue in emergency room 3, someone shouted. I ignored his request and took a stand. "I'm Lieutenant Hayes, a Navy combat medic. Let me do compressions," she said firmly to the young doctor. He hesitated for a second, but something in my eyes, maybe the determination, maybe the desperation, convinced him. "Okay, Lieutenant, do you have experience with CPR?" "More than I'd like," I replied, placing my hands in the center of my grandfather's chest. I began compressions with the precision that only comes with extensive practice. Push hard, push fast, 100 compression per minute. "Someone count," I ordered, entering the command mode I learned in the Navy. A nurse began counting out loud. My compressions were firm and rhythmic. Each movement was a silent promise to my grandfather. "I'm not letting you go. Not today." 30 full compressions, the nurse announced. The doctor administered 2 breaths with the bag valve bag. The monitor still showed asystolia flatline. "Continuing compressions," I said, resuming the rhythm. "Administering epinephrine," another nurse reported. injecting the medication into the 4. My arms began to tire, but I ignored the fatigue. In the Navy, I learned to push physical limits, especially when lives were at stake. And what life could be more important to me than that of the man who inspired my entire career? Second round complete, the nurse announced. The doctor checked the monitor. No response yet. Preparing defibrillator. I stepped away momentarily while they loaded the machine. Stand back, the doctor ordered, and everyone moved away from the bed. My grandfather's body jumped with shock, but the monitor continued to show a straight line. Resuming CPR, he said, returning to his previous position. My compressions were mechanical now, driven by adrenaline and a refusal to accept the inevitable. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Dr. Patterson. Lieutenant, it's been 20 minutes, he said softly. 20 minutes of unresponsive CPR meant virtually no chance of recovery. I knew it. Every medical professional, but I couldn't stop. 5 more minutes, I insisted, continuing compression. So Dr. Patterson exchanged glances with the younger doctor, who nodded slightly. 1 more shot of epinephrine, he ordered, giving me the benefit of the doubt. As I worked, I spoke to my grandfather in a low voice, just so he could hear, if he could hear at all. Come on, Grandpa, you're stronger than this. Remember when you taught me to swim? You said giving up wasn't an option for the haze. Sweat poured down my face, my muscles burned with exhaustion, but I pressed on, driven by memories and a stubborn refusal to say goodbye. Lieutenant, Dr. Patterson called again, his voice gentle but firm. It's time. I looked at the monitor, still a straight line, at my grandfather's face pale and still, at my hands shaking with exertion. 1 last try with the defibrillator, I asked, stepping away. They delivered the final shock. My grandfather's body twitched, but the monitor remained stubbornly the same. Tears began to fall free. Now blurring my vision, I felt Dr. Patterson touch my arm. I'm sorry, Lieutenant. We did everything we could. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 6:47 a.m., time of death. 6:47, the younger doctor announced, his voice solemn. My parents entered the room, having been kept outside during the procedure. My mother let out a muffled sob at the sight of my grandfather, motionless and the silent monitor. My father hugged her tightly, his own face wet with tears. I stood beside the bed, still in uniform, still standing almost at attention. Lieutenant Hayes had failed in her most important mission. I leaned over and kissed my grandfather's now cold forehead. Rest easy, sailor. Your mission is accomplished. The next few days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, condolence visits, and endless paper. My commander extended my leave, understanding my grandfather's importance in my life. The funeral was held with full military honors, as was fitting for a decorated veteran. The sound of the trumpets playing taps still echoes in my ears when I close my eyes at night. The folded American flag that covered his casket now rests in a glass case in my living room. A week after the funeral, I returned to duty. My colleagues were respectfully supportive, offering silent condolences with firm handshakes and understanding looks. In the Navy, we understand loss. It's part of the job, part of life. On my first day back, I was assigned to training new recruits in emergency medical procedures. Ironically, CPR was on the curriculum that day. I looked at the young sailors, their eager, inexperienced faces, and saw myself a few years ago. I thought of my grandfather and how he would have approached this lesson. Good morning, recruits, I began. Today, we're going to learn how to save lives. But first, I want to tell you a story about why that matters. And I told them about my grandfather. Not about his death, but about his life. How he saved wounded comrades in Vietnam. How his skilled hands stitched battle wounds under enemy fire. How his legacy lived on through me and all those I taught. When you perform CPR, I told them, you're not just following a protocol. You're fighting for someone's life. Someone who is loved. Someone who matters. Do it as if it were for the most important person in your life. I saw determination light in their eyes, and I knew they had achieved their goal. That night, I returned home and opened a box my mother had given me. After the funeral, it contained some of my grandfather's personal belongings, his wristwatch, some medals, and a diary from his time in Vietnam. I leafed through the diary, my fingers tracing the firm handwriting. On one page, I found an entry dated 1968, after a particularly brutal battle. Today, I lost Johnson. His wounds were too severe. I worked on his chest for nearly an hour, refusing to give up. The chief medical officer finally pulled me away, saying he was already gone. I understand this intellectually, but my heart refuses to accept it. As a medic, I'm trained to save lives. When I fail, I question, but tomorrow there will be another soldier who... So I face my pain and move on. That's what we do. Tears stained the page as I read his words. Even after all these years, my grandfather and I were so alike, determined to the end, devastated by failure, but always ready to try again. 6 months passed. The pain of loss was still there, but less acute, more like a constant companion than an open wound. I was promoted to lieutenant commander and assigned to the USS Mercy, a Navy hospital ship. It was a new chapter in my career, an opportunity to honor my grandfather's legacy on a grander scale. On my first day aboard, I visited the main sick bay. It was an impressive space, equipped with cutting-edge technology and staffed by highly trained professionals. As I walked the corridor, observing the preparations for our humanitarian mission in the Pacific, I felt a strange sense of peace. A young nurse approached. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, welcome to Mercy. I've heard a lot about you. Thank you. First day? Yes, ma'am. A little nervous, to be honest. I smiled. You know, my grandfather used to say, courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you're afraid. She smiled back. You look like a wise man. He was, I replied. And his lessons live on through the lives we touch. That night, I stood at the bow of the ship, watching the sun set over the ocean. The sky was painted in shades of red and gold, reminding me of my grandfather's medals. I'm moving on, Grandpa, I whispered to the wind, continuing your mission. And for a moment, I felt his presence beside me, proud and strong, as he always was in life. I remembered that fateful morning in the hospital. I had done all I could. He had led the compressions with all the skill and strength he possessed. I hadn't saved my grandfather, but I had learned his final lesson. Sometimes, true courage lies in accepting what we cannot change and continuing our duty anyway. As a Navy officer, I know that the mission is always greater than the individual. My grandfather knew this too. And now, aboard this ship that brings healing and hope to distant places, his mission continues through my hands. A year after my grandfather's death, our hospital ship was anchored near a remote island in the South Pacific, part of a humanitarian mission following a devastating cyclone. The island had little medical infrastructure, and our presence was vital to the survivors. We worked tirelessly, treating the wounded, distributing supplies, and helping rebuild the small local clinic. The days were long and exhausting, but deeply rewarding. On a particularly chaotic afternoon, a young pregnant woman was brought aboard in premature labor. Complications quickly arose. She was bleeding heavily, and her baby was in fetal distress. We need an emergency C-section, I announced, preparing for the procedure. Trauma team, room 1, now! As we prepared, I noticed something peculiar about the woman's wrist. She wore a military-style braided bracelet. When I asked about it through the interpreter, she explained that it had been a gift from an American doctor who visited her island decades ago during another humanitarian mission. The doctor had saved her father and given the bracelet to her as a protective talisman. A shiver ran down my spine. Do you remember this doctor's name? I asked as we prepared for surgery. The interpreter spoke to her briefly and then turned to me. She says it was Dr. Hayes. James Hayes. My eyes welled up with tears behind my surgical mask. My grandfather had served humanitarian missions in this region after Vietnam. Somehow, decades later, I was about to help the granddaughter of someone he had saved. Tell her that Dr. Hayes was my grandfather, I told the interpreter, and that I will care for her as he would have. The surgery was intense, with critical moments when I thought we might lose both mother and son. But I remembered my grandfather's determination in Vietnam, his refusal to give up even in the worst circumstances, and I worked with unwavering precision and focus. An hour into the procedure, the cries of a healthy baby filled the operating room, followed by the equally comforting sound of the mother's stable, vital sign. They're both fine, I announced to the team, who responded with tired but satisfied smile. Later, I visited the new mother in the recovery ward. She held her son, wrapped in a navy blanket. Through the interpreter, she thanked me and then asked permission for something special. She would like to name the baby James. after her grandfather and the man who saved her father, the actor explained. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. It would be a great honor, I finally replied. She removed the bracelet from her wrist and placed it in my hands. She says she must now return to the Hayes family. I accepted the gift reverently, recognizing the full circle that had come. My grandfather had saved a life decades ago, and now I had helped bring a new life into the world, a life that would carry his name. That night, in my small cabin, I attached the braided bracelet to the framed photo of my grandfather that I kept beside my bed. In his photograph, he was in full uniform, young and strong, with the same determined smile I saw in the mirror. We continue, Grandpa, I whispered. The mission continued. 2 years have passed since that fateful day in the hospital. I was promoted to commander and submitted my name for consideration for the Navy's Flight Medic Program, Elite, specialization in aerial medical rescue and evacuation. The competition was fierce, with only 2 spots available. The training would be rigorous, combining advanced trauma skills with high-risk flight operation. The day before my final interview, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Dr. Patterson, the doctor who had treated my grandfather. Commander Hayes, the letter began. I hope this finds you well. I've been reflecting on that morning 2 years ago, when you so skillfully led the compressions to try to save your grandfather. Rarely have I seen such a combination of technical expertise and personal compassion. I wanted you to know that your performance that day inspired me to implement a new protocol at our hospital, allowing family members with medical training to participate in emergency procedures when appropriate. We've already seen remarkable results. Your grandfather would be proud of the legacy you two have created. Good luck in your future endeavors. I kept the letter in my desk drawer, next to my grandfather's diary and the folded flag from his funeral. Each item was a piece of the puzzle that formed my story. The next day, during my interview, one of the interviewers asked why. I wanted to become a flight doctor because I believe every second counts, I replied. Because I've been on the other side as a desperate family member watching someone I love fight for their life. And because I've learned that even when we can't save someone, the effort matters. The dignity we provide in their final moments matters. I told my grandfather's story the morning he told me to step away and taking over the compressions. I explained how that moment defined me not only as a doctor but as a person. In the end, I concluded, we are defined not by the results we achieve, but by the battles we choose to fight. As a flight medic, I want to be on the front line, bringing care to those who need it, when they need it most. A week later, I received the notification I had been accepted into the program. My new journey was about to begin. The night before I left for training, I visited the military cemetery where my grandfather was buried. The setting sun cast long shadows across the orderly rows of headstones, each representing a life of service. I placed a single white rose on her grave and knelt in the grass. I'm going to heaven, Grandpa, he said with a small smile. Not the way you went, but in rescue helicopters. I'm going to save people from places no one else can reach. The gentle wind ruffled my hair, almost like a loving hand. I closed my eyes and imagined him beside me, offering advice in his deep, comforting voice. Remember, Sammy, he would say in the confusion of rescue, remain calm. Your patients will follow your example. If you show fear, they will feel fear. If you show confidence, they will find hope. I opened my eyes, determined. I will make you proud, I promise. Every life I save will be part of your legacy too. I stood and saluted at his grave. It wasn't protocol for civilian, but it felt right. My grandfather had taught me that some traditions transcend regulations. Flight medic training was as brutal as I expected. Months of rescue simulations in extreme weather conditions, medical procedures in confined spaces, and evacuation scenarios under enemy fire. I often recalled my grandfather's stories about Vietnam, how he performed emergency surgeries in violently shaking helicopters with the sound of gunfire in the background. Those stories, which had fascinated the child I was, now served as a blueprint for the doctor I became. 6 months after beginning training, I received my first operation assignment, the USS Arlington, an amphibious assault ship with medical evacuation capability. Our mission was to support rapid response forces in disaster zones in Southeast Asia. On my first real rescue, we were sent to a mountainous area in the Philippines following a devastating A remote village had been hit by a landslide, stranding dozens of injured people without access to medical care. Our team consisted of myself, 2 paramedics, and an experienced pilot named Martinez. The weather was terrible, heavy rain, and limited visibility. Ideally, the mission would have been challenging enough. In this weather, it bordered on impossible. "Can you land in these conditions?" I asked Martinez as we examined satellite images of the area. He rubbed his chin, his face scarred from years of dangerous missions. "There's a clearing about half a kilometer from the landslide's epicenter. It's not ideal, but it's our best option. The question is, can you transport the injured across that terrain?" I looked at my paramedics and saw the same determination in their eyes that I felt. "We did it," I replied without hesitation. As our MH-60 Seahawk helicopter sliced through the heavy clouds, I prepared my medical equipment. Each item had been carefully selected for maximum efficiency and portability. My grandfather would have been impressed by the medical advancements since his time-field transfusion kits, hemostatic tourniquets, medications he could only dream of in Vietnam. 2 minutes to landing," Martinez shouted over the intercom. I adjusted my helmet and checked my life jacket one last time. My team took position, holding on tight as the helicopter descended through the pouring rain. The landing was rough, with gusts of wind rocking the aircraft like a toy. As soon as we touched down, we jumped out, shielding our eyes from the mud kicked up by the rotor blade. "Hold position and stand by for extraction," Martinez instructed. "We'll return with the most critical cases first." With medical backpacks on our backs and folding stretchers in hand, my team and I began the difficult trek to the buried village. The mud was ankle-deep, each step demanding double the effort. The rain continued to fall, soaking our uniforms and making the terrain even more treacherous. After a strenuous 20-minute walk, we reached the remains of what had once been a small fishing village. The scene was desolate: destroyed houses, uprooted trees, and local residents desperately digging through the rubble for survivors. An older man, likely the community leader, ran toward us. In broken English, he explained that there were at least 30 injured people, some in critical condition, trapped under collapsed structures or on the mountainside. "Show us the most serious ones first," I ordered, already putting on my gloves and opening my medical. We were taken to a makeshift structure made of tarpaulin and debris. Inside, several injured residents moaned in pain. My quick assessment identified 5 top priority cases: a young woman with severe head trauma, an elderly man with a probable pneumothorax, 2 children with exposed fractures, and a middle-aged man with clear signs of internal bleeding. "We need to evacuate these 5 immediately," I informed my team. "Johnson, stabilize the children's fractures. Ramirez, prepare the elderly man for transport, paying special attention to his chest. I'll take care of the woman and the bleeding." Man, we worked methodically, applying our training in conditions no simulation could truly replicate. Mud continued to seep into the makeshift tent, mixing with the blood on the ground. The distant roar of new landslides occasionally drowned out the patient's groans. As I inserted an IMA into the arm of the woman with the head injury, I noticed something familiar around her neck: a small St. Christopher medal, identical to the one my grandfather always wore. "You're going to be okay," I whispered in her ears. I administered medication to reduce her intracranial pressure. "I'm going to get you to safety." With the 5 critically ill patients stabilized for transport, we began the arduous journey back to the helicopter. Each of us carried a patient on a stretcher, inching our way through the mud and debris. The weight was immense, not just physically, but emotionally. These lives now depended on us, on our strength, our determination. Halfway across the clearing, the man I was carrying with internal bleeding began to deteriorate rapidly. His pulse weakened, and his breathing became shallow. "We have to stop," I yelled to my team. "This patient is decompensating." We carefully lowered the stretcher, and I knelt in the mud beside him. His abdomen was distended and firm, a classic sign of massive internal bleeding. His blood pressure was dropping rapidly, despite the intravenous fluids we administered. At that moment, I faced an impossible decision: continue the transport and likely lose it, or perform an emergency procedure right there, in the middle of a storm, without the proper equipment. I thought of my grandfather, of the impossible decisions he made on the battlefield. "What would you do, Grandpa?" I murmured, weighing my options. The answer came almost as if he were standing next to me. Use what you have. Do what needs to be done. I need to do an emergency laparotomy, I announced to my team. Now. Their eyes widened, but no one questioned. Ramirez quickly improvised a shelter using a tarp from our supply backpack, while Johnson held a flashlight to give me visibility. With steady hands, I made an incision in the man's abdomen using a basic field surgical kit. Rain dripped through the makeshift tarp, but I maintained my absolute focus. Once I accessed the abdominal cavity, I identified the source of the bleeding, a laceration in the clamps, I requested, and Ramirez immediately handed me what I needed. With precise movements, I isolated the bleeding vessel and ligated it. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would give the patient a chance of reaching the hospital alive. Close it, I instructed Johnson as I stood up. We need to move now. We resumed our journey, each step more difficult than the last. When we finally spotted the helicopter in the clearing, I felt a wave of relief wash over my exhausted body. Martinez saw us approaching and began preparing for immediate takeoff. We loaded the patients on board, carefully positioning them and securing their stretchers. Nearest hospital? I asked Martinez as I checked the vital signs of the man I had operated on. Naval base in Subic Bay, 40 minutes flight time under normal conditions. In this weather, maybe an hour. I nodded, mentally calculating how long my critical patients would last. We'll need blood transfusions for 2 of them as soon as we arrive. Radio ahead and have ONEG units ready for our arrival. As the helicopter took off, battling wind and rain, I continued working tirelessly. I monitored vital signs, adjusted medications, and spoke comforting words to conscious patients. Saul, while the aircraft shook violently. The woman with the head injury opened her eyes briefly and grabbed my hand. She murmured something in her native language that I didn't understand, but her eyes conveyed gratitude. We're almost there, he told her, squeezing her hand gently. You're strong. Keep fighting. During that hour-long flight, I mentally relived every medical procedure, every decision made. I had improvised surgery in the middle of a landslide, under conditions that would make most surgeons hesitate, even in well-equipped hospitals. My grandfather would be proud, I thought, as I checked the abdominal bandage of the man I had operated on. His pulse was stronger now, his blood pressure stabilizing. When we finally landed at the Subic Bay Naval Base, a full medical team awaited us. We quickly transferred the patient, passing on all relevant information to the doctors who would take over their care. The head surgeon, a middle-aged man with graying hair, examined my emergency laparotomy with an impressed look. Who made this? He asked, examining the improvised stitches. I, sir, I replied, exhausted but firm. In the field? During a landslide? When I nodded, he continued, in 30 years of military medicine, I've rarely seen such impressive work under such adverse conditions. This man owes his life to you, Commander. I accepted the compliment with a curt nod, but my thoughts were on flight. There were still dozens of injured people in the village, awaiting rescue. After a quick check of our equipment and a resupply of medical supplies, we were ready to return. Martinez, our tireless pilot, was already preparing the helicopter. Ready for another round, Commander Hayes? He asked with a half smile, despite the exhaustion evident on his face. Always, I replied, adjusting my helmet. We have a job to finish. We made 3 more flights that day, rescuing a total of 27 people from the isolated village. When night finally fell, making further flights impossible, I collapsed into a chair in the base's break room, my muscles shaking with exhaustion. The base's chief medical officer came over with a mug of coffee and sat down next to me. All your patients are stable, he reported, including the laparotomy man. You performed a miracle today, Commander. I took a sip of coffee, allowing the warmth and caffeine to revitalize my exhausted body. It wasn't a miracle, Doctor. It was training, determination, and maybe a little guidance from someone who's no longer with us. He looked at me curiously, but didn't ask any more questions. He just nodded respectfully and walked away, leaving me to my thoughts. That night, lying on a makeshift bed at the base, I dreamed of my grandfather. In the dream, we were side by side in a helicopter, flying over a mountain landscape. He said nothing, just smiled, that characteristic smile of his, full of pride and quiet strength. I woke to the sound of distant thunder, feeling strangely refreshed despite the brutal day I had just had. I looked at my hands that had performed emergency surgery in the mud, that had held dying patients, that had continued the work my grandfather had begun decades before. The mission continues, I whispered to myself, getting up to face a new day. 3 years had passed since that first rescue in the Philippines. I had gained a reputation as one of the Navy's top flight medics, specializing in emergency procedures under extreme conditions. My case of the improvised laparotomy during the landslide had become study material at Military Medical Academy. At age 31, I was promoted to captain, the youngest woman to achieve this rank in my division. The ceremony was simple, as I preferred, held aboard the USS Mercy during our deployment to the Indian Ocean. After the formal event, I found a quiet moment on deck, watching the sun set over the calm waters. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, with a few stars beginning to appear. "Captain Hayes," called a familiar voice. It was Martinez, my pilot from that first mission in the Philippines, now commander of his own rescue squadron. "Commander Martinez," I replied with a smile. "Have you come to admire the view?" "I came to bring you something, actually." He held out a small packet. "It arrived for you while we were docked in Singapore." Curious, I carefully opened the package. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small object wrapped in cloth. The letter was from the Philippines, from the village we had rescued 3 years earlier. The man I had performed the emergency laparotomy on had survived and made a full recovery. The community had built a small clinic in honor of our rescue, naming it the Hayes Martinez Clinic. "They named the clinic after us," Martinez said emotionally. Smiled. I read my copy of the letter. "It's an honor I don't deserve. I only flew the helicopter. You saved those lives." I unrolled the small object from the fabric and found a St. Christopher medal, identical to the one my grandfather wore, the one I saw around the neck of the woman with the head injury that day. The letter explained that this was a local tradition, giving the protective medal to those who saved lives. It was a symbol passed down from generation to generation, from doctor to doctor. "It feels like you're part of something bigger now," Martinez observed. I held the medal tight, feeling its symbolic weight. "I always have," I replied softly. That night, I pinned the medal next to the braided bracelet I'd received years earlier. My collection of memories and connections grew, each item representing a life touched, a promise fulfilled. I opened my grandfather's diary, my regular nightly, and found an entry that seemed especially relevant. "Medicine is not just about procedures and drugs, it's about connection. Every patient we treat becomes a part of us, and we become a part of them. It's an unbroken chain of humanity, passing from hand to hand through time." I added my own entry below his. "Today, I understand what you meant, Grandpa. We are links in a chain, connecting past and future. Your medal is now my medal. Your hands are now my hands. And together, we continue to save lives, even when separated by time." 4 years after my promotion, I found myself in a situation that would test everything I had. Our hospital ship was stationed near a conflict zone in the Middle East, where American forces were supporting peacekeeping efforts. We received an emergency call. A Marine patrol had been hit by an improvised explosive device. There were multiple casualties, and the nearest landing zone was still a 15-minute walk from the blast site. As the most experienced flight medic available, I led the rescue mission. Our helicopter took off under the orange dawn sky, carrying my medical team and specialized trauma equipment. The pilot, a young lieutenant named Rodriguez, skillfully navigated through plumes of smoke and rugged terrain. 2 minutes to landing, Captain," she informed him. "There are reports of possible snipers in the area." I adjusted my body armor and checked my service. Pistol a necessary precaution I hoped I wouldn't need to use. "Understood. Keep the rotors spinning for quick extraction." As soon as we landed, my team and I ran outside, crouched low as we'd trained. 2 Marines met us at the landing zone and quickly escorted us to the attack site. The scene was chaotic. A destroyed military vehicle, wounded soldiers being tended to by combat medics, the air thick with the smell of fuel and blood. Instantly, I went into the automatic triage mode I'd honed over the years. 4 critical, 3 stable, 2 mild, reported the medical sergeant who had first responded to the attack. The critical ones require Immediate evacuation. I approached the first critical patient, a young Marine with both legs severely wounded by shrapnel. As I knelt to examine his tourniquet, a secondary explosion shook the ground less than 100 meters away. "Defensive position," someone shouted, and everyone who could move took cover. The young Marine gripped my arm with surprising strength for someone who had lost so much blood. "Don't leave me, doctor," he pleaded, his eyes wide with fear. "I won't leave anyone behind," I replied firmly, continuing to work even as the sound of gunfire echoed in the distance. My team and I worked methodically, stabilizing the critically injured for transport. With each patient, I made quick decisions: who could wait, who needed to go first, what procedures to perform right then and there to ensure they would survive the flight. As we treated the last critical patient, an officer with a penetrating chest wound, the sound of gunfire intensified. "We have to go now," shouted the leader of the Marine escort. "We can't hold this position much longer." We had stabilized all 4 critical cases, but the 3 patients with moderate injuries also required hospital care. The helicopter could only carry 6 people besides the crew and medical staff. "Take the critical ones first," I decided quickly. "I'll stay with the others until they can send another helicopter." "Captain, this violates protocol," my head nurse protested. "We shouldn't separate the medical team." I looked at the wounded and the exhausted Marines guarding them. "These men need constant medical supervision. You take the critics, I'll take the moderates." There was no time for lengthy discussions. With military efficiency, we loaded the 4 critical patients onto the helicopter, along with my head nurse and an attending physician. "Get back as quickly as possible," I instructed Rodriguez over the radio as the helicopter took off, leaving me with 3 wounded patients and a small force of Marines in hostile territory. One of the Marines, whose badge identified him as Sergeant Miller, approached. "The next helicopter won't be arriving for at least 45 minutes, Captain. We need to move to a more defensible position." I assessed my patients, one with an open fracture of the arm, another with a shrapnel wound to the abdomen, and the third with a head injury that, although not initially serious, concerned me because of the subtle signs of increased intracranial pressure. "Can we move them?" Miller asked. "We have to move," I replied, already preparing the patients. "But we need to be extremely careful with the man with the head injury. Any sudden movement could worsen his condition." Miller assigned 2 men to each patient, plus 2 for protection. I carried my medical backpack in one hand and my gun in the other, a combination I never imagined when I joined the Navy, inspired by my grandfather's medical. We moved slowly through partially destroyed buildings, staying low and vigilant. The soldier with the head wound began to show more obvious signs of intracranial pressure, equal pupils, and decreased motor response. "We need to stop," I announced as we reached the remains of a small warehouse with solid walls. "This man needs immediate intervention." While the Marines established a defensive perimeter, I prepared a procedure rarely performed outside a hospital: an emergency trephination to relieve pressure on his brain. "Sergeant Miller," I called, "I need your assistance." The sergeant, a burly man with eyes that had seen more combat than most, knelt beside me. "What can I do, Captain?" "I'm going to perform a procedure to save his life. I need you to hold his head absolutely still and alert me if there's any sign of enemy approach." Miller nodded gravely, understanding the seriousness of the situation. With precise movements, I prepared the area of the skull where a depressed fracture was creating dangerous pressure. Using an advanced field surgical kit, I created a small opening to relieve intracranial pressure. It was a procedure he'd practiced in simulations, but never performed in the field, much less under enemy fire. Every movement needed to be meticulously controlled, every decision potentially fatal if wrong. "Grandpa, guide me," I whispered inaudibly as I worked. The procedure took a tense 20 minutes, during which occasional gunfire was exchanged around the perimeter. By the time I finished, the patient was already showing signs of improvement, his pupils responding more symmetric, his breathing more regular. "Impressive," Captain Miller commented. "Genuinely odd. Where did you learn to do that?" "In theory, in medical school," I replied, cleaning my bloody hands with antiseptic. "In practice, I think I learned it from my grandfather, although he never performed this specific procedure." Miller looked at me curiously. But our moment of reflection was interrupted by the sound of the radio. The second rescue helicopter was 5 minutes away. "Prepare to move," Miller ordered his men. We quickly checked on all 3 patients. All were stable enough for transport thanks to the continuous care we were able to provide during the wait. "We'll establish an extraction corridor," Miller said. "Doctor, stay with the patients. We'll ensure their safety." As the Marines strategically positioned themselves, I followed my own pre-transport check protocol. Each patient received a final dose of pain medication, every dressing was checked, every vital sign mentally recorded. The helicopter appeared on the horizon, its silhouette silhouetted against the darkening sky. At the same time, the sound of gunfire intensified northeast of our position. "Enemy contact!" one of the Marines yelled. "Multiple snipers approaching!" Miller organized a quick defense as the helicopter maneuvered to land at a safe distance. "We need to get there," he said, pointing to the landing zone. "About 100 meters. On exposed terrain." I assessed the situation. 3 wounded patients, enemy fire intensifying, and 100 meters of open ground between us and salvation. "Let's move the patients first, one at a time," I suggested. "Your men can provide cover while we transport each one." Miller agreed, and we quickly established transport team. I would accompany the first patient, the man with the trepanation, who was still the most critical. "On my command," Miller said, positioning his men. 3, 2, 1, ... Now, we ran low across the exposed terrain while the Marines fired to suppress enemy snipers. My focus was entirely on keeping my patient stable during the bumpy transport. We reached the helicopter and quickly transferred the first patient. Wasting no time, the transport team returned to retrieve the second, while I began monitoring the first from the relative safety of the aircraft. From my position, I could see the second and then the third patient being transported under increasingly intense fire. Finally, the Marines themselves began to retreat back to the helicopter, providing cover for each other in a well-coordinated, lethal ballet. Miller was the last aboard, jumping into the helicopter as bullets slammed into the metal around him. "All aboard! Take off! Take off!" he shouted to the pilot. The helicopter rose rapidly, maneuvering in an evasive pattern as we moved away from the conflict zone. Inside the cabin, I continued monitoring my patient, adjusting medications, and checking vital signs despite the turbulence. "You're crazy, you know that?" Miller said, sitting down next to me after the situation stabilized. "Staying behind like that, performing cranial surgery under enemy fire." He smiled slightly as he adjusted the foredrip on the patient with the abdominal wound. "Just following a family tradition, Sergeant." "Well, your family must have an interesting history," he commented, wiping the sweat and dust from his face. "My grandfather was a combat medic. In Vietnam," I explained. "He used to say that the true test of a medic is not what we do under ideal conditions, but what we can accomplish when the odds are stacked against us." Miller nodded respectfully. "I think he'd be proud today." I looked at my patients, all stable, all alive, all with a chance of returning home to their family. "I hope so," I replied softly. The rest of the flight passed in relative silence, each of us processing the day's events in our own way. When we finally landed, on the deck of the hospital ship, a full medical team was waiting to receive the patient. Chief Medical Officer Captain Reynolds personally supervised the transfer. When he reached the patient with the trepanation, he stopped and examined my work with an experienced eye. "Field trepanation?" he asked, disbelief in his voice. "Yes, sir," I replied. There was no alternative. He was developing signs of brain herniation. Reynolds studied me for a moment before speaking. "You know, Hayes, there's a saying in military medicine, there are procedures no one should attempt in the field, and then there are what doctors like you can perform when necessary." He paused. "Your grandfather would be proud." I blinked in surprise. "You knew my grandfather, sir? James Hayes?" "Of course I did. He saved my life in Vietnam in '68. He's why I became a doctor." Reynolds smiled nostalgically. "He performed a thoracotomy on me using a combat knife and a pen tube under a burning helicopter." My heart raced. "I've never heard that story. There were many he probably never told," Reynolds replied. "Men like your grandfather didn't boast about their accomplishments. They just did what needed to be done." He squeezed my shoulder briefly. "Just like you today." I watched as they wheeled my patients into surgery, a strange sense of completion washing over my exhausted body. My grandfather had saved Reynolds decades ago, and today I had continued his legacy by saving others. The chain of healing continued, passing from generation to generation, connecting strangers across time and space. That mission changed something fundamental in meeting Reynolds, discovering another piece of my grandfather's legacy, reinforced my understanding of the impact a single life dedicated to service can have. 6 months later, I was invited to teach at the Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, a prestigious position that would allow me to train the next generation of military medics. The decision wasn't easy. Part of me still yearned for the adrenaline rush of the field, the immediate satisfaction of saving lives in critical situations. On my last day aboard the hospital ship, I went up on deck to watch the sunset. The ocean stretched endlessly, reflecting the orange sky like a perfect mirror. I thought of all the lives I had touched in the past few years, the improvised procedures, the impossible decisions, the hands I had held in their most vulnerable moments. I thought above all of my grandfather. I pulled from my pocket the St. Christopher medal I now carried as a talisman, along with the braided bracelet from the Philippines, tangible symbols of an intangible chain that connected us through time. I remembered that fateful morning in the hospital years ago, when my grandfather frowned dismissively and said, "Stand back," before the code blue signal sounded. I remembered how I led the compressions, refusing to give up, even when it seemed like it was too late. I didn't save him that day, but in a way, he saved me every day since. His lessons, his example, his silent presence guiding my hands through the most challenging moments. "The mission continues, Grandpa," I whispered to the sea wind. "Through my hands, through the doctors I will train, your work continues." On the horizon, the last ray of sunlight faded, giving way to the first stars of night. A new phase was beginning, not an end, but a continuation. James Hayes's legacy would not end with me. It would be passed on, multiplied through every life I touched, every student I inspired, every story I told. I pocketed the medal and bracelet and turned to leave the deck. Tomorrow would be my first day in Bethesda. A new mission awaited, as vital as any war zone rescue, to mold the hands that would one day perform their own miracles. After all, as my grandfather always said, courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you're afraid. And what needed to be done now was to pass on what he had learned, to continue the chain, to keep alive the healing tradition he started so long ago. As I left the ship that had been my home for years, I felt a strange sense of peace. For a fleeting moment, I could almost feel my grandfather's hand on my shoulder, his deep voice whispering, "Well done, Sammy, well done."